The office building stood tall against the city skyline, filled with people who walked in and out every day, carrying briefcases, sipping coffee, and talking about numbers, reports, and big plans. Among them worked a woman who rarely drew attention to herself. She wasn't dressed in fancy clothes or expensive shoes. She wore a simple uniform, always neat, always clean, and her head was usually bowed as she pushed her cart of supplies from one corridor to another. She worked quietly, making sure every desk was dusted, every trash can emptied, every floor shining before the next morning arrived. Few noticed her, but she noticed everything. She knew who stayed late, who left in a hurry, who was kind enough to greet her, and who pretended she wasn't even there. She had worked there for years, and though her pay was modest, she never complained. What most of her coworkers didn't know was that she carried a story on her shoulders heavier than the cleaning supplies she pushed every day. She was a single mother, raising a young child on her own. Every morning before sunrise, she would prepare a small breakfast, pack a simple lunch, and make sure her child was dressed and ready before she left. She didn't have family nearby to help her, and hiring babysitters cost more than she could afford. Most of the time, a neighbor kindly watched her son until she came back. But that neighbor had her own life, her own job, and some days it simply wasn't possible. On one such morning, when the sun had barely painted the sky with light, she faced that very problem. Her neighbor had called her the night before, apologizing and saying she couldn't look after the boy. The woman sat at the edge of her bed that night, her heart heavy with worry. She thought of asking someone else, but who? Everyone she knew was busy trying to manage their own lives. She looked at her son, who was asleep with his hand tucked under his cheek, and her eyes filled with tears. She whispered softly to herself, "What am I going to do?" Morning came and she made her decision. She couldn't miss work. Missing even one day meant losing wages, and every coin mattered. Rent, food, clothes, school supplies. It all added up, and there was never enough left over. So she got her child ready and said gently, "You'll come with me today. You'll stay close and you'll be quiet. We'll get through this." The boy, though young, understood more than she realized. He nodded and simply said, "Okay, Mama." She dressed him in his best little shirt, gave him a notebook and some pencils, and carried their lunch in a small bag. As they walked toward the tall building, she prayed silently that nobody would scold her, that nobody would make a fuss. She wasn't doing this because she wanted to. She was doing it because she had no other choice. When they entered the office, her heart pounded. She kept her head down, pushing her cart as usual, while her son walked beside her, holding her hand tightly. She led him to a quiet corner in the staff area where she usually kept her supplies. "Stay here, my love," she whispered. "Draw in your notebook. Don't wander, and if anyone talks to you, just smile." He nodded again, obedient and calm. Throughout the morning, she worked quickly and carefully, more aware than ever of the people around her. She worried that someone might notice her son and complain. Some colleagues did see the boy sitting quietly, his legs swinging under the chair as he drew pictures of houses, trees, and superheroes. A few whispered to each other, raising eyebrows. Some shook their heads as if to say it wasn't right, while others felt a pang of sympathy, but nobody said anything to her face. She moved from one office to the next, wiping down desks, changing trash bags, polishing glass. All the while, she kept glancing back to make sure her son was still sitting safely in the corner. Each time she saw him bent over his notebook, her heart softened. He didn't complain, didn't ask for toys or television. He just sat quietly, as if he understood the weight she carried. But not everyone looked at the situation kindly. Two employees passing by stopped near the supply room and whispered, "Can you believe she brought her kid here? This isn't a daycare." The other shrugged. "Well, what can she do?" Maybe she didn't have a choice. The first shook their head and walked off, leaving behind a cloud of judgment that hung in the air. The woman overheard parts of it, and her face grew warm with shame. She wanted to hide, wanted to explain that she wasn't irresponsible, that she was only trying to survive. But she had no time for excuses. Instead, she bent her head lower and kept cleaning, hoping the hours would pass quickly. Her son, meanwhile, had started drawing something new. On the white sheet of paper, he drew a tall building that looked much like the one they were in. In front of it, he sketched a small figure pushing a cart, with a smile on her face. Above her, he wrote in shaky letters, "My hero." He looked at the drawing for a long moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He thought of showing it to his mother later, when she was less worried. He wanted her to know that even if others looked down on her, to him she was the strongest, most important person in the world. The day wore on, and the boy sat quietly, sometimes doodling, sometimes resting his head on the desk. His mother worked non-stop, barely pausing even for a sip of water. She was afraid that if she slowed down, someone might complain, and that could cost her dearly. But inside her heart she carried both fear and love, the fear of being noticed for the wrong reasons, and the love that gave her the strength to keep going despite everything. By noon, her son grew hungry, and she led him to a small corner of the break room. They sat at the edge of the long table, away from others, and opened the lunch she had packed. It was simple, 2 sandwiches and an apple split between them. She handed him the larger half, smiling softly. "Eat, you need it more than me." He frowned, shaking his head. "No, Mama, you eat too." They shared the food, each trying to give the other the bigger portion, their quiet exchange unnoticed by most of the busy staff rushing past. As they ate, a few people glanced their way. Some pitied the sight, a child in a break room eating a plain sandwich while his mother in a work uniform sat beside him. Others frowned, thinking it was unprofessional. But none of that mattered to the boy. For him, lunch with his mother, even in a workplace corner, felt safe, felt warm. After lunch, she guided him back to the supply corner. "Just a little longer," she whispered. "I'll finish soon, and then we'll go home." He nodded again, patient and trusting. She returned to her tasks, wiping fingerprints off glass doors, straightening chairs, and sweeping floors. Each movement was done with care, as though her life depended on it. And in many ways it did. She knew she wasn't like the people who sat at the desks, typing away at computers, wearing suits and shoes that cost more than her month's salary. She was the one who made the place clean for them. Invisible in the background, yet essential. Still, she often wondered if anyone truly saw her. That day, with her child sitting quietly nearby, she felt more exposed than ever. She prayed no one important would notice, no one powerful enough to send her away. But life has a way of bringing the unexpected, sometimes in the very moment we fear it most. And as she continued to polish the glass door of the main conference room, she didn't realize that someone was about to walk in, someone who would see not just her, but also the small figure waiting patiently in the corner, and whose reaction would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the building, casting golden streaks across the polished floor. Workers rushed in and out of offices, their shoes tapping against the tiles, their conversations filled with deadlines and meetings. In the middle of all this movement, the woman continued her work, quietly wiping down surfaces and straightening chairs, her eyes always drifting toward the corner where her son sat. He was still patiently sketching, though his small legs kicked restlessly under the chair. Every time their eyes met, he offered her a reassuring smile, as if to tell her he was fine. She forced herself to smile back, but deep down, she worried. She worried that someone would complain, that her supervisor might scold her, that her job, her only lifeline, would slip from her hands because of this one desperate choice. But she also knew she couldn't turn back time. Her son was here, and she had to make the best of it. Around mid-afternoon, the sound of a heavy door opening echoed through the hallway. It wasn't the usual sound of employees coming and going. It was different, more commanding. A man stepped into the building, tall, confident, his shoes polished to perfection, his suit perfectly pressed. He was the owner of the company, the man whose decisions shaped the lives of hundreds who worked there. His presence carried weight, and everyone who noticed him straightened a little, adjusting their voices and their posture. The woman bent over a desk with her cleaning cloth froze for a second. She had only seen him from afar before, usually when he walked through the lobby surrounded by managers. He was a figure of authority, a millionaire whose name was spoken with both respect and awe. She lowered her head even further, hoping he wouldn't notice her, silently praying that today of all days he wouldn't walk past the corner where her son sat. But fate, unpredictable as always, had other plans. The man's steps carried him down the corridor, and as he turned toward his office, his sharp eyes fell on the small boy. The boy was sitting quietly, bent over his notebook, his small hands gripping a pencil as he drew. It was unusual. Children were not part of this world of business suits and briefcases. He slowed his pace, curiosity sparking. "Whose child is this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. His words carried through the hallway, and a few employees turned to look, whispering among themselves. The boy froze, clutching his notebook to his chest, and looked up at the tall figure before him. There was no fear in his eyes, only innocence. The woman's heart raced. She set down her cloth and quickly approached, bowing her head as she stood between her son and the man. "He's mine," she said softly, almost in a whisper. Her hands trembled as she rested them on the boy's shoulders. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I had no one to leave him with today." The man looked at her, then at the child again. His expression was unreadable. Around them, a few employees paused, waiting to see what would happen. Some expected anger. Others expected her to be told off, maybe even fired. After all, this was a workplace, not a home. But the silence stretched on, and instead of anger, something else flickered across the man's face. Something softer. He studied the boy, who clutched his notebook tighter, and then shifted his gaze to the woman, who stood nervously, her eyes lowered but her shoulders tense with worry. "What's your name?" he asked the boy. The boy hesitated for a second before answering quietly. The sound of his small voice carried an innocence that made the moment feel heavier. The man nodded, his eyes softening slightly. "And what are you drawing there?" he asked, gesturing toward the notebook. The boy blinked and slowly opened it, revealing pages filled with simple sketches. Houses with chimneys, stick figures with smiling faces, trees reaching toward the sky. In the middle of one page, a drawing stood out. A woman pushing a cart, a wide smile on her face. Above her, written in uneven letters, were the words, "My hero." The man's eyes lingered on that page. For a moment, his expression changed, though he quickly masked it. He had seen many things in his life: luxury, power, success. But something about that child's drawing touched him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't the artistry, it wasn't the lines or shapes, it was the meaning. A child who saw his mother not as tired or struggling, but as a hero. The woman, still anxious, tried to explain. "He won't disturb anyone. He's very quiet. I promise this won't happen again. Please don't be upset." The man raised his hand slightly, signaling her to stop. His tone was calm, almost gentle now. "He hasn't disturbed me," he said. Then, turning back to the boy, he asked, "Have you eaten lunch?" The boy glanced at his mother, then back at the man. "Yes, sir," he answered softly. The woman nodded quickly. "We brought food from home," she added, her voice still nervous. For a long moment, the man stood in silence, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, to the surprise of everyone watching, he crouched down slightly so that he was at the boy's eye level. "You draw very well," he said with a small smile. "Keep doing it. One day you might be great at it." The boy's eyes widened and he nodded shyly. His mother stood frozen, unsure how to react. She had expected anger, perhaps even punishment. But this was something she hadn't imagined. Without another word, the man straightened up and continued walking to his office. The employees who had gathered nearby exchanged looks of disbelief. They had expected a scolding, maybe even drama. Instead, what they saw was kindness, subtle but powerful. The whispers began again, this time filled with surprise. The woman let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She guided her son back to his chair, her heart pounding but also strangely relieved. She bent down and kissed his head softly. "See? Everything is okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the building seemed different. People who had judged her earlier now looked at her with mixed emotions. Some still frowned, thinking rules had been broken. Others felt moved, realizing there was more to her story than what they saw on the surface. The boy continued drawing, and at one point, he accidentally dropped one of his pages near the corridor. It fluttered across the floor, unnoticed by him but caught by another pair of eyes, the man's. As he stepped out of his office later, he picked up the paper. It was another drawing of his mother, this time standing tall in front of a shining building. She looked bigger than the skyscraper itself, her smile wide and her hands outstretched as if she carried the weight of the world. The man studied it for a moment, his mind wandering back to his own childhood. He remembered his own mother, who had worked tirelessly, though in different ways. He remembered how he had once thought of her as the strongest person alive. For the first time in a long time, a sense of humility settled over him. He placed the paper carefully back on the boy's desk without saying a word. The boy looked up in surprise, then smiled brightly, as if receiving an unspoken blessing. The rest of the day passed quietly, but something had shifted. The woman didn't know what the future held, but she sensed that her encounter with the company's owner was not just a passing moment. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he looked at her child's drawings, that made her believe he had truly seen them, not just as a worker and her child, but as people with a story. And though she didn't yet know it, that moment of curiosity, of unexpected kindness, was only the beginning of something that would change her life forever. The next morning started like any other, but there was a different kind of tension in the woman's heart. She woke up before the sun, as she always did, preparing a simple breakfast while her son rubbed the sleep from his eyes. She tried to smile, tried to act normal, but her mind kept replaying the image of the company's owner crouching down and speaking kindly to her child. She wasn't sure if she should be relieved or worried. Did his kindness mean he understood her situation? Or was it just a moment of politeness soon to be forgotten? Her son, however, seemed happier than usual. He carried his notebook proudly as if it were a treasure chest and kept asking if he could take it again. "Maybe I'll show him another drawing," he said with innocent hope. His mother didn't have the heart to tell him that encounters like yesterday didn't happen often. She just kissed his forehead and whispered, "We'll see." When they arrived at the building, the usual rush of employees filled the air. Some glanced at the boy again, whispering under their breath. Others offered small smiles, as if they had softened after witnessing what happened yesterday. Still, she could feel the weight of eyes on her. She hated being the subject of gossip, but she had no choice. Today again, she had no one to leave her son with. She brought him along, praying that he would remain unnoticed. She settled him back into the corner with his notebook and pencils. "Stay here, my love. Be patient, and I'll finish as quickly as I can." He nodded, already busy sketching a new picture of a tall tree with a swing hanging from its branch. As she worked, she felt her nerves prickling with every passing moment. She couldn't stop thinking about the man who owned the place. Would he walk by again? Would he still be kind if he saw her son again? She didn't know, and the uncertainty made her hands tremble as she wiped down a desk. Around mid-morning, her fears came true. The sound of polished shoes echoed down the hallway, steady and purposeful. She glanced up, and there he was again, the owner, walking with two managers at his side. They were discussing something serious, their voices low and filled with business terms she didn't understand. But as they passed the corner, his eyes drifted toward the boy again. This time, instead of walking past, he paused. The manager stopped too, puzzled by his sudden halt. He walked closer to the boy, who looked up with wide eyes and then quickly held out his notebook as if offering a gift. "This one's for you," the boy said shyly. On the page was a drawing of a man in a suit standing beside a boy, both smiling under a bright sun. The man in the picture had hair combed neatly and shoes drawn shiny, not unlike the owner himself. The owner took the paper gently, his stern face softening again. He studied it for a moment, then gave the boy a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This is very good." The managers exchanged confused glances. They weren't used to seeing their boss linger over a child's drawing. But they said nothing. The woman hurried forward, bowing her head. "I'm sorry, sir. He shouldn't bother you. Please forgive us," but the man shook his head. "He isn't bothering me," he said calmly, folding the drawing carefully as though it were valuable. "What's his name again?" he asked, turning to the boy. The boy answered softly, his voice steady this time. The man repeated it, almost testing the sound of it on his tongue, and then gave a nod of approval. "You're a good boy. Take care of your mother." The boy's face lit up, and he nodded eagerly. His mother stood frozen, unsure what to say. The managers seemed restless, waiting for their boss to move on. But he stayed for a few more seconds, looking between the child and the woman. There was something thoughtful in his eyes, as if he were considering something he hadn't before. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, the managers following closely behind. The whispers started again as soon as he left. Employees who had witnessed the moment shook their heads in disbelief. Some murmured, "Why is he paying attention to them?" Others said, "Maybe he has a kind heart after all." No one could deny, though, that something unusual was happening. The woman returned to her work, her cheeks flushed. She couldn't understand why he was showing interest in her child. Was it pity, curiosity, or something deeper? She didn't know, but she couldn't ignore the way her son's eyes sparkled with happiness. For him, this was no ordinary day. For him, someone important had noticed him, praised him, and accepted his drawings. And in his small heart, that meant the world. At lunch, they sat in their quiet corner again, sharing sandwiches. The boy kept talking about how the man had smiled at him, how he had taken the drawing. "Do you think he'll keep it?" he asked excitedly. His mother smiled weakly. "Maybe," she said. "But don't expect too much, love. People like him, they live in a different world than us." The boy shook his head. "He's nice, I can tell." She didn't argue. She just stroked his hair and let him dream. Deep down, she wanted to believe her son was right. But life had taught her to be cautious. Dreams often broke too easily. The afternoon passed slowly. As she moved from one office to another, she couldn't shake the thought of the way he had looked at her. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as though he had truly seen her, not just as a cleaner in a uniform, but as a person. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Later in the day, as the offices grew quieter, the boy wandered a little further down the hall, still holding his notebook. He stopped near a window where the sunlight poured in and began to draw again. A passing employee frowned and muttered, "Children don't belong here." The boy lowered his head, but before the employee could say more, a familiar voice cut through the air. "He's with me," the owner said as he appeared from the corner. The employee stiffened, stammered something, and quickly walked away. The boy looked up at the man with wide eyes. The man didn't smile, but his words carried protection. "Don't mind them," he told the boy. "Keep drawing." The woman, watching from down the hall, felt tears prick her eyes. She quickly wiped them away before anyone could see. It was a small moment, but for her, it meant everything. For the first time, she felt as if someone had stood up for her child, someone powerful enough that others listened. By the end of the day, her son had filled several pages with new drawings. When it was time to go home, he ran to her with excitement, showing her each one. "I want to show him more tomorrow," he said, his voice full of hope. She hugged him tightly, torn between worry and gratitude. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing. Something inside those office walls had shifted. People were beginning to see them differently, and it all started because one man had chosen to stop, notice, and care. What none of them knew yet was that these small gestures, simple words, a kind look, the acceptance of a child's drawing, were building toward something far greater. Something that would not just change how people saw them, but would alter the course of their lives in a way that would leave everyone speechless. The days that followed felt different inside the office building. The woman noticed it every time she pushed her cart down the hall. People who once walked past her without a glance now looked at her a little longer. Some smiled politely, some whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, and a few even greeted her softly. She wasn't used to that kind of attention. For years, she had been invisible, blending into the background of the workplace. But now, because of her son and the unexpected interest from the company's owner, she and her child had become the quiet subject of conversation. Her son, innocent to the gossip and judgment, only knew joy. Every morning he begged her to bring his notebook, his pencils, and sometimes even an extra page folded neatly for the man he admired. "Maybe he'll look at this one too," the boy would say with a hopeful smile. The woman wanted to tell him not to get his hopes up, but she couldn't crush the light in his eyes. It was rare for her son to feel excited about anything, and she didn't want to take that away from him. On the third day, the owner walked into the office again, this time without his managers. His steps were slow, thoughtful, as though he was looking for something. When his eyes fell on the boy who was sitting near the window drawing, his expression softened. The boy looked up, grinning, and quickly held out his notebook. "I drew another one for you." The man walked over, crouched slightly, and took the page carefully. This drawing showed a woman standing with a broom in her hand, but she was taller than all the buildings around her. She looked like a giant who protected the city. At the bottom of the page, the boy had written, "Strongest Mama." The man stared at it for a long moment. Something about it pierced through the walls he had built around himself over the years. He had seen success, money, and power, but rarely did he see raw honesty. He looked at the boy, then at the woman, who was standing nearby nervously with her hands clasped together. Finally, he spoke. "Your son sees the world differently. That's a gift." The woman lowered her eyes. "He only draws what he feels, sir. I'm sorry if it distracts you." But the man shook his head. "It doesn't distract me." His voice was firm but kind. He turned slightly to her and added, "Come to my office later when you finish your work. I want to speak with you." Her heart skipped. She nodded quickly, her palms sweating. All day she worked with trembling hands, her mind racing. Why? Did he want to see her? Was she in trouble? Or was it something else? Every possibility ran through her head and none of them gave her peace. When the building grew quieter that afternoon, she told her son to wait in the corner and hurried to the owner's office. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, and his voice called from inside, "Come in." The office was grand, filled with tall shelves, wide windows, and leather chairs. She stepped in timidly, clutching her hands together, her eyes lowered. He was sitting behind his desk, but he set his pen down as soon as he saw her. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She hesitated before lowering herself onto the edge of the seat. Her heart thumped loudly in her chest. For a moment there was silence. He studied her, not with the cold eyes of a boss, but with the thoughtful gaze of someone trying to understand. "I've seen you here for years," he began slowly. "You're always working hard, always quiet. Most people don't even notice you, but I have. And now I've seen your son too. Tell me, why do you bring him here?" Her throat tightened. She had prepared herself for anger, but the question was soft, almost caring. Still, the truth wasn't easy to share. "I don't have anyone to watch him, sir," she admitted. "Sometimes a neighbor helps, but not always. I can't afford babysitters, and I can't miss work. If I do, I lose pay, and we can't survive without it." Her eyes lowered further. "I'm sorry if it's against the rules. I don't want to cause trouble." He leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. "How long have you been working here?" 7 years, she replied quietly. His brows lifted slightly. 7 years was a long time, and yet she had remained in the same position, doing the same work unnoticed by many. He thought of the drawing her son had given him, the one where she was taller than the buildings. To the child, she wasn't just a cleaner. She was the strongest person in the world. "You've given a lot to this company," he said finally, "more than most realize. And you've done it while raising your child alone. That's not easy." Her eyes widened slightly at his words. No one had ever acknowledged her struggles before. Most people only saw her uniform, never the person behind it. He continued, "I want to help you, not out of pity, but because you've earned it. You've worked with loyalty and dignity. That deserves recognition." Her hands shook. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. "Help me," she repeated softly. He nodded. "Yes, I want to offer you a new position, something better, with higher pay, so you don't have to worry about surviving day to day. And as for your son," he paused, as if choosing his words carefully, "I'd like to arrange for his education, a scholarship at one of the better schools. He deserves a chance to grow, to use his gift." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "Just know that you and your son won't have to struggle alone anymore." At that moment, she couldn't hold back her sobs. Years of silent suffering, of working through exhaustion and fear, of hiding her pain from the world, they all poured out. She bowed her head, tears dripping onto her lap. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "Thank you so much." The man stood and walked around the desk. For a moment she flinched, unsure what he would do, but he only placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your strength deserves respect," he said quietly. "Don't ever think you're invisible." When she left his office, her eyes were still wet, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She walked back to her son, who looked up at her eagerly. "Mama, what did he say?" She knelt and hugged him tightly. "He wants to help us," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Things are going to change, my love. Better days are coming." The boy grinned, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "I told you he's nice," he said happily. That night, as they sat together in their small apartment, she looked at her son as he drew another picture by the dim light of the lamp. This time he drew 3 figures, a boy, his mother, and a man in a suit standing together, smiling. Above them he wrote one simple word, family. She watched him quietly, her chest swelling with emotions she couldn't put into words. Maybe life was finally giving her a chance. Maybe for once the world had seen her not as invisible, but as someone worthy of kindness. And though she didn't yet know how big the change would be, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that tomorrow would be brighter, not just for her, but for her son too. The next few weeks felt like a dream the woman had never dared to imagine. For the first time in years, she didn't walk into the office with fear of being noticed for the wrong reasons. Instead, she walked with quiet pride. She wore the same uniform, pushed the same cart, but her heart was lighter because she knew her life was no longer standing still. The promise the owner had given her wasn't just words, he had already taken steps to make it real. Her son was enrolled into a private school, the kind of place she used to pass by on buses, looking at the tall gates and polished playgrounds with a heavy heart. Now her little boy was walking through those gates with a new backpack on his shoulders and shoes that didn't pinch his feet anymore. The first morning she dropped him off, she felt her throat tighten. She had to fight back tears as she watched him run into the schoolyard with other children, his laughter blending with theirs. For once, he wasn't the boy left behind. He was part of something bigger, something brighter. The owner had kept his word about her too. She was moved into a new role at the company, one that still allowed her to work with dignity but no longer left her body aching every night. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it came with better pay, steady hours, and most importantly, respect. People looked at her differently now. Some were curious, some jealous, but many were simply kinder. For the first time, her name was known beyond just a list of cleaning staff. She wasn't invisible anymore. One afternoon, while she was organizing files in her new office space, the owner stopped by. He didn't have to, but he did. He leaned against the doorway casually, as though he had known her for years. "How's your son liking the new school?" he asked. She stood quickly, smoothing her blouse. "He's happier than I've ever seen him. He talks about his teachers, his new friends, even the playground." "I can't thank you enough, sir." He smiled slightly, shaking his head. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. You've raised him well. I only gave him an opportunity, but the rest is his and yours." Her eyes softened. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. It wasn't just the help he gave, it was the way he made her feel seen, valued. She bowed her head in gratitude, but this time, it wasn't from shame, it was from deep respect. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between the 3 of them, the woman, her son, and the man, grew in small but meaningful ways. The boy often drew new pictures for the owner, who kept every one of them neatly in a folder inside his office. Sometimes, when the boy came to visit after school, the man would sit with him, asking about his day, encouraging him to dream bigger. And the boy did dream bigger, talking about becoming an artist, an architect, maybe even building something that would last forever. The woman, watching these moments quietly, felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She had carried the world on her shoulders alone for so long, but now it felt like someone had lifted part of that weight. She didn't know why the owner had chosen to step into her life, but she couldn't deny the goodness he had brought. One evening, after a long day, the owner invited her and her son to dinner. It wasn't in a fancy restaurant, as she expected, but in a simple family-style place where the food smelled of home. She hesitated at first, feeling out of place, but he treated her with ease, making sure she and her son felt comfortable. They laughed, shared stories, and for a few hours, the differences between them seemed to disappear. The woman saw not just a wealthy businessman, but a man with a kind heart, someone who understood what it meant to care for others. That night, as she tucked her son into bed, he whispered, "Mama, he's like family now, isn't he?" Her chest ached with emotion. She brushed his hair gently and whispered back, "Maybe he is, my love. Maybe he is." As time went on, their story spread quietly within the company. Many employees began to see the woman not as the cleaner she once was, but as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that everyone has a story worth hearing. Some even started greeting the cleaning staff with more kindness, realizing how easily they had overlooked them before. It was as though the woman's journey had opened not just one man's eyes, but many. But the woman herself remained humble. She still lived simply, still worked hard, and still poured her heart into raising her son. She didn't let the new opportunities change who she was at the core. Instead, she used them to stand taller, to walk with more confidence, and to give her son the life he deserved. One day, as she watched her son drawing at the kitchen table, she noticed something different about his picture. He had drawn 3 figures again: himself, his mother, and the owner, but this time, the figures were standing under a big sun, with a caption at the bottom that read, "Together, we shine brighter." She stared at it for a long moment, tears pricking her eyes. She realized that her son understood something even she struggled to put into words. Kindness has the power to change lives. Not just theirs, but everyone who witnessed it. Years later, when her son grew into a young man, he often spoke about the moment everything changed, when his mother had brought him to work out of desperation. And instead of being shamed, they were lifted by an act of compassion. He carried that lesson with him, not as a memory of charity, but as a reminder of dignity, hope, and the way people can choose to care for each other. And the woman, even as her hair turned silver, never forgot the day her son's drawing caught the eye of someone who could have easily ignored them, but chose not to. She lived with gratitude, but more importantly, she lived with proof that even in the hardest of lives, kindness could bloom in unexpected places. Her story wasn't one of wealth or fame, but one of quiet strength and extraordinary grace. And to those who knew it, it left them speechless, not because of the millionaire's actions alone, but because of the humble heart of a mother who never gave up, and the innocent love of a child who saw her as the tallest, strongest figure in the world.